Do you want to absolutely delete bosses, Uber Lilith, tormented bosses, and still be able to clear far into the infernal hordes? Enter the Bash Barbarian. This build is hitting for billions, and I haven't even finished my gear yet. This is an endgame build, and is one of the many variations of Bash that's out there. Let's check out this Uber Lilith fight, and then we'll jump into the build. To start this fight, when you run it, you're going to try and clear your 2 guaranteed overpowers. You want the first guaranteed overpower to be from critically hitting with Bash 4 times. This way it goes straight to Hammer of the Ancients. Hammer of the Ancients will use these 2 buffs first before it uses the critically strike chance with Bash buff. What we want to do is run in. As soon as she starts her animation, we're going to... When you start this fight, we're actually going to clear the 2 guaranteed overpowers that we have using Hammer of the Ancients before the fight starts. We want to be able to critically hit with Bash 4 times. That will give Hammer of the Ancients a guaranteed overpower. If we don't get that buff up first, these 2 buffs will be used before your guaranteed overpower from Bash. That will not be applied to Bash. It's only applied to Hammer of the Ancients. So you have to be able to use Hammer of the Ancients once, and this is going to clear your buff, and then you're going to clear your other buff. When you get in there, you start bashing, get your guaranteed 4 hits from Bash, and then you're going to hopefully have these 2 come up right as she starts to do her first attack. When the first attack starts, that's when you want to do all your damage, so you make sure that you don't send her up into the air when she gets below 70%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear Hammer of the Ancients. 1, 2. Then we're going to run in. Let's see the timer right here. We're going to wait just a couple seconds. Now we're going to start attacking. You're going to hammer, and then you're going to go. That's kind of how you're going to clear it. You can use that as a guide. Your count up right here. This is every 12 seconds, so you know exactly how much time you have for your next overpower. So we're going to clear again. And then we have a guaranteed overpower with Bash. We're going to pop Warcry. We're going to hammer. And then we're going to start bashing again. And that's your Lilith fight. So in order to make this a little easier, I always start in the corner. We just run up and around as soon as she cuts the platform. As long as you have about 155% movement speed, you can stay all the way right along the edge. Watch that last little shade. When she cuts the platform here, that's when you run across. Run all the way around the top and then down. You make a nice big long loop. Come all the way down. As soon as she flies up, you're going to start running up also, so that she cuts the platform right as you cross it. Come all the way around to the top here. I normally like to pop Rallying Cry right here because she does a knockback, and then you just run forward and you hit her once. That is your Lilith fight on a Bash Barbarian. Alright, we're going to go over the skill tree. Starting at the top, we're going to put as many points as we can into Bash. When you take points out of Bash or you add points in, if you watch the damage numbers, they're going to go up pretty significantly. So we're going to put 5 points into Bash. Then we're going to go up into Enhanced Bash, and then through Combat Bash. The reason that we're going to take Combat Bash, after critically striking 4 times with Bash, using a 2-handed weapon. Now that's key, because if you're running a dual-wield version of Bash, Combat Bash does not work. You only take this when you're running a 2-handed version. Your next core or weapon mastery skill will overpower. After we put those points here, and where that Combat Bash is going to come into play, we're going to put 1 point to Hammer of Ancients, all the way down through Violent Hammer of the Ancients. We took Combat Bash because it's going to guarantee Hammer of the Ancients to overpower. When Hammer of the Ancients overpowers, we get 40% X damage for 5 seconds. You critically strike 4 times with Bash, then you use Hammer of the Ancients once. It gives you 40% increased damage for 5 seconds. Coming down, we're going to go 3 points into Imposing Presence, and then 3 points into Martial Vigor. This is going to give us 12% DR. We're going to go into Rallying Cry for a source of Unstoppable, We're also going to go through Strategic Rallying Cry. This is going to be our source of Fortify generation. We're going to have Iron Skin for this. We're going to go 1 point to Iron Skin all the way down through Tactical Iron Skin. This is going to be a source of Unstoppable, a barrier, and also a really big heal. This is the great option for when you have that moment where all your life goes away and then you need something to save you. Coming down, we're going to go 1 point to Warcry all the way through our Warcry. The reason that we're taking Power Warcry, when you're running the new Infernal Hordes, which is where you really are going to do all of your farming, there is always going to be more than 6 enemies unless you're fighting the boss. Getting through those waves and getting as many kills as you can will give you the most rewards, so we want to do the most damage possible. We're going to add an additional 10% multiplicative damage to Warcry. We're going to go 3 points into Booming Voice. This is going to increase our shout duration by 24%. We're also going to take 3 points into Raid Leader. This gives us a passive heal. We're going to be running Tyrael's Might in this build, so we do want to make sure that we're constantly going to be at full life. We're going to go 3 points into Aggressive Resistance. This is going to give us some damage reduction while we're berserking. We're always going to be berserking. We're going to have enough cooldown to make sure that berserking is up all the time. With this build, we actually won't need to run Anchor Management because of how fast our skills are going to get cooled down. Moving down, we're going to go 3 points into Pit Fighter. This gives us a 9x increased damage to close enemies and a little bit of distance DR. That's not very common when you're playing a Barbarian, so this will make a little bit of a difference. We're going to go 3 points into Slaying Strikes. Really, the only place you're going to need this and you're going to feel this is when you're fighting the bosses at the end of the Infernal Hordes or when you're in the pits. Everything else is going to die relatively quickly, not enough to hit that 35% or lower, which is the injured state. We're going to do 1 point into Steel Grasp. We're going to go all the way down through a Warrior Steel Grasp. We don't need the berserking, so we take the extra charge because we are going to be making enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. With that 3 seconds and 3 charges, we can keep this up for quite a bit of time. Most of the time, this will last long enough to get us all the way through to the next exploit before we need to wait for this to cool down. We're going to do 1 point into Thick Skin so we can unlock Counteroffensive. When our Fortify is over 50%, we're going to deal an additional 12% increased multiplicative damage. Our Fortify will always be over 50% because of how fast we're going to heal and how often our cooldowns are going to be coming up. We're going to go 3 points into Heavy Handed. Because this build is going to be running the Grandfather, we're going to get as much critical strike damage as we possibly can. The Grandfather takes your critical strike damage and then multiplies it by 2. We're going to go 3 points into Brute Force. We're going to be using a 2-handed weapon, and our Overpower is where all of our damage is going to come from. So we're going to put as much into Overpower as we can to get those really big hits. We're going to do 3 points into Wallop. Because Bash has to use a bludgeoning weapon, we're going to get 15% increased damage if the enemy is vulnerable or stunned. We're going to put 1 point into Unconstrained. And the way that this works out, we have 1 point left. My favorite option is going to be going into Swiftness. If we're not going to go into Swiftness and you want a little bit more DR, you can always go into Guttural Yell. But I love movement speed, so I'm going to go there. So that's skills. We'll look at the Paragon board next. All right, looking at the Paragon board, going into the starter board, we're going to be taking Exploit. This is going to give us vulnerable damage to enemies whenever we damage them for 3 seconds. This can only occur once every 20 seconds, which is why we're going to supplement that with Steel Grasp. Moving up into the Blood Rage node, we're going to be berserking all the time, so we don't have to worry about killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant berserking. What we do want to focus on is your damage is increased by 10% of your damage while berserking bonus. This only goes up to 30%, which means that you get up to 300% damage while berserking. So we don't want to go really any higher than that. You can. It's not going to hurt you at all. It's going to just add additive damage instead of multiplicative damage. Inside of this board here, we're going to be running Ire. We're going to get a little bit more damage while berserking here. It's also going to grant us 10% reduced damage from elites while we're berserking, and we should be berserking 100% of the time. In the next board, we're going to be running Decimator. Each time you make an enemy vulnerable, you're going to increase your damage by 10% multiplicatively. That's going to last for 5 seconds. When you overpower a vulnerable enemy, that grants an additional 10% bonus for 5 seconds. We are always going to be overpowering. We are going to guarantee overpowers with Hoda every 5 seconds using Bash, if not more. We also are going to have other ways that we're going to guarantee our overpowers. So we're constantly going to have this 20% multiplicative number up instead of just the 10% here. In this board, we're going to be running Might. This is going to give us an 8x increased damage when we're using a two-handed weapon. Coming over, we're going to be going into the Carnage board. While berserking, critical strikes increase your attack speed by 2%, up to 16% for 6 seconds. Our critical strike chance has gotten high enough that this is going to be up all the time. Because we're using a two-handed weapon, it's a little bit slower. We want to be stacking a lot of attack speed to make sure that we're hitting constantly, we're critting constantly, so we can always be using Combat Bash. In the board, we're going to be running Wrath. Because this is going to be a grandfather build, we want to make sure we get as much critical strike damage as possible. We also want to be generating Fury because, as you guys are going to see later on, Bash, even though it's a basic skill, is now actually going to cost Fury to use, which is much different than it's ever been in any other season. Moving down, we're going to go into the Bonebreaker board. This is where we're going to start getting our guaranteed overpowers. Every 12 seconds, your next skill is guaranteed to overpower. Inside the Bonebreaker board, we're going to be running Crusher. We're going to be using this because while wielding a mace, which is what we're going to be using for Bash, you deal 20% multiplicative increased overpower damage. We're stacking overpower so we can get our hits in. It is hitting very hard. For the final board, we're going to be in the Flawless Technique board. We're only going to be using this to take the glyph, and this is going to be our second source of guaranteed overpower. We're going to be running Dominate. Every 20 seconds, your next attack will overpower. This is also going to give us another 86% overpower damage. So we're stacking overpower damage here. We've stacked overpower damage throughout the rest of the Paragon board anywhere that we can. Overpower is going to be your big hits. It feels like the Hammer of the Ancients build just using Bash. Next, we're going to look at the affixes, aspects, and tempers. We're going to head over to the blacksmith. For the gear, we're going to start with the helmet. We're going to be running the Harlequin's Crest. For your master working here, we're going to go into cooldown reduction as much as you can. If you can hit a triple, perfect. If not, your max life and cooldown reduction are going to be your best choices. We don't need the max resources for this, and armor, obviously, as you can see, we are way over cap, and we don't even need to be running the skull, and we're still going to be over cap. The cap for armor is 9,230, so as soon as you get over that, you don't need to worry about armor, anything at all, ever again. For the chest piece, we're going to be running Tyrael's Might. In my humble opinion, this is the hands down best uber unique of the season. There are builds out there that do not use it, but for the builds that can use this, this is the number one. It saves you so many affix lines, and it has movement speed on it. You do not have to find resistances on any other piece of gear. It gives you a ton of damage reduction. Between these two pieces of gear here, you have all of the resistances you need and all of the extra armor you need, and this gives you up to almost 50% DR if you hit a triple on DR. The best things to hit for your master working on this is going to be your damage reduction. Personally, I would go straight into 3 if you can. I haven't done it yet. If you get a 2 and you get maximum resistances to all, that would be your best options here. For your Pain Gorgers, this one right here is cool. I'll show you guys what the Pain Gorger buff looks like. This basically takes the Bash Cleave and spreads it out even further. But once we get back into the gameplay loop, I'll show you what the buffs look like and how Pain Gorgers works. For your masterworking crits here, ranks to basic skills is hands down the best option for you. Get as many into this as you can. For the pants, we're going to be running Iron Warrior. Remember, we're taking Iron Skin. What Iron Warrior does is it grants Unstoppable, but you can never go wrong with Unstoppable. It gets you out of stuns, freeze, slow, whatever crowd controls you. It also grants you an additional 35% damage reduction. 35% here, we have 39% here, and we have 20% here. We're going to take a ton less damage just between these 3 pieces of gear. For the affixes, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, and then of course ranks to Bash. If you can get your triple masterworking into ranks to bash, that is 100% your option. For the tempering, my pants are actually bricked. This was not what I wanted. I wanted iron skin cooldown reduction, and then I wanted barrier generation. What the barrier generation does, it increases the size of your barrier. Iron skin barrier absorbs 211% more of your maximum life. If I take off barrier generation gear, so like this one right here, if I take off my barrier generation gear and I look at iron skin, it goes down to 199%. So the more barrier generation we can stack, the bigger the barrier is. For the boots, we're going to be running Hectic. After casting a basic skill 5 times, which is Bash, so Bash is your basic skill, after casting it 5 times, you reduce the cooldown of one of your active cooldowns by 2 seconds. When we get into the gameplay loop, I'll show you what that looks like, but it cools your stuff down very quickly because we actually do have a lot of attack speed that we're going to be running. For the affixes, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, and for me, I'm running Fury per second. Bash is going to cost Fury now. So the only way to generate Fury in the very beginning is to either get hit or to run Fury per second. This can be traded out if you want to for ranks to Warcry. If you wanted to run Brawling skill ranks here or run ranks instead of Max Life, you can do that too. For me, I really personally love having Max Fury all the time. It does make a big difference, so that's what I'm going to be running. For the tempers, we're going to be running Barrier Generation, which we just talked about, and then Movement Speed. For the weapon, this is going to be your two-handed weapon that we're going to be using for Bash. Bash can only use bludgeoning weapons, so you cannot set it to anything else. So Bash will be using your two-handed base. We're going to be running Moonrise. Damaging an enemy with a basic skill grants 4% attack speed for 10 seconds. This stacks 5 times. We get 20% attack speed. Once you reach your maximum stacks, you go into a vampiric blood rage. This is kind of a fun aspect here. When you go into that blood rage state, you gain 160% increased basic skill damage and 15% movement speed. Now remember, movement speed is life. That is my favorite attribute in this whole game. I hate running slow builds. I love running maximum speed builds. For the affixes here, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike damage. Then for your tempers, we're going to be running Bash, Cleave, and Critical Strike damage. Masterworking crits, I actually want this to be into Bash, Cleave. You will actually get the most damage out of that. If you guys are following along with this build, make sure you check out the planner. My gear and my masterworking is not going to be 100% of where I want it to be yet. I'm still working on it. But the planner is going to have the absolute optimal setup that I would love to run. So if you can get that setup that's in the planner running, you're probably going to hit harder than I do. You're probably going to do better than I do. So follow along the planner. For the dual wield weapon, we're going to be running Rapid. Your basic skills gain 30% increased attack speed. For the affixes here, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike damage. And then again, for tempers here, we actually want to be running Bash, Cleave, and Damage while Berserking. Now, if you notice, I was under cap for my Damage while Berserking bonus from the Blood Rage node. If I switch this, I would max out my Damage while Berserking bonus, and I would gain that 30%. For the second dual wield weapon, we're going to be running Shard of Varathiel. This is going to give us a massive boost to our basic damage. Basic skills are going to deal up to 200% increased damage. This is where Bash starts to cost Fury. Now it's going to cost 25 Fury. That's okay, because we're going to be reducing that cost quite a bit with the start ring of Starless Sky. We'll get to that later though. With our Fury generation and our Fury per second, even without the Ring of Starless Sky, you can maintain your maximum Fury as long as you're hitting targets. If you're bashing the air, which is doable, and we'll go over that in your gameplay, you will run out of Fury here. For the slashing weapon, we're going to be running the Granddaddy, Grandfather. This is going to take your critical strike damage bonus, and it's going to double it. So we take this off, it goes all the way down to 1600. It is actually just slightly more than doubling. Not too sure where the multipliers go, but we're not going to try and do any math tonight. This is going to be a huge increased damage to your critical strike damage. For the masterworking here, damage is still going to be the best option if you're going for an all-out damage build, which at this point, when you have gear like this, all-out damage is all you really want to look for. It is additive damage. It is a big additive damage number, but damage is going to be the one that we're going to go for. For the ring, we're going to be running the Ring of Starless Sky. This just keeps getting better. It is such a good piece of gear. It has everything that you possibly could want, except for the core skills. That doesn't do anything for us. But what this does is spending primary resources reduces the resource costs of your skills and increases your damage by up to 50% multiplicative. That's huge. You get half the resource cost just sliced off the top of it. So now Bash doesn't cost 25. Bash only costs 13. You get a 50% increased damage just straight up. You don't have to do anything at all. You just get that. This is a very, very big source of resource saving gear and also increased damage gear. For the other ring, we're going to be running Edge Masters. Skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on the available primary resources. We are always going to be full. It's pretty much never drops down at all, especially if you're hitting monsters. So we're always going to be doing that 20% increased damage, and that's going to be our skills, which is going to be Bash. For the affixes here, we're going to be running optimally. I would like to be running attack speed, critical strike chance, critical strike damage. And then for your tempers, we're going to be running Warcry cooldown and damage while berserking. For your necklace, we're going to be running adaptability. First part of this, we don't really need to worry about too much. It actually does help a little bit now that Bash costs Fury, because in the previous seasons, when we used Bash never cost any resources, so we didn't need to generate any resources, but now we're actually going to be generating resources and spending resource. When you cast Bash and it's at or above 50% of your maximum resources, your basic skill damage is increased by 120%. If you combine this with this, with this, it is a ton of extra damage to Bash. For the affixes here, we're going to be running attack speed, critical strike damage, ranks to heavy-handed. The tempers, we're going to be running damage while berserking, and then movement speed. The last thing we're going to cover for gear is going to be the expertise. The way that expertise works, you don't actually have to be running the weapon that you're going to be selecting to get the bonus. We're not running any two-handed axes, but we're still going to be able to get the bonus of the 10% increased damage to vulnerable enemies by using this expertise here. This is the way that we're going to be running almost every build. This is the only one that gives you straight multiplicative damage to vulnerable enemies at all. For the gems, for survivability, and while you're pushing, you want to be running rubies. This doesn't have to be this way all the time. I have 5 strength gems. Depending on what I'm running and depending on how my character feels, I'm going to be swapping these in. If I'm running bosses, which this build can carry any tormented boss that you want to do Lilith, you can swap your strength gems in, and then you can make the swap Iron Skin or Wrath the Berserker for a lot of extra damage, and this thing melts bosses. For the weapons, we're going to be running Topaz. This is going to grant additional basic skill damage. And at this point in your gear, if your gear has gotten to this, you actually don't need anything at all in the jewelry, which is crazy. But it actually is the way that they made the game right now. What would be super fun, and this is just 100% theory crafting, is that they add a rune or something specific to the jewelry that you can add in if you don't need any resistances. If your character is not quite here yet, and you still need resistances, you can either run diamonds for all resist, or if you need specific resistances, then you choose a specific gem. If you're over your resistance cap, but you're under your armor cap, then you put skulls in, and that will give you enough armor to make sure that you feel comfortable and your character is strong enough. For your weapon selection, there is only one way to do this. We're going to be running a two-handed weapon for Bash, and then Hammer of the Ancients can only run a two-handed bludgeoning weapon also. Steel Grasp does not run any weapons, so your weapons of choice will already be selected for you, so you don't need to worry about it. Okay, that is the gear, your affixes, your tempers, your masterworking, all of it. We're going to head to the training grounds, and I will show you exactly what the gameplay loop looks like for this. All right, for the gameplay loop, it is a little tricky because you have to pay attention a lot more than normal. Once you get your critical strike chance up high enough, then you really don't have to worry about it too much. But remember, we took Combat Bash. We have to be able to make sure we are using Hammer of the Ancients when we critically hit 4 times. The part about this is if you use Steel Grasp before you use Hammer of the Ancients, Steel Grasp is actually a weapon mastery skill. So you can hover over the middle here and you can see weapon mastery. If we use Steel Grasp instead of Hammer of the Ancients, we're going to take that guaranteed overpower away from Hammer of the Ancients. So before you actually do anything, you need to make sure that this is your buff here. Once that hits 4, I've critically hit 4 times with Bash. If I Steel Grasp first, that is gone. And now when I use Hammer of the Ancients, I don't overpower. So when you're doing this, you need to make sure that you get 4 crits, then you can Hammer of the Ancients, and then use Steel Grasp. That'll give you your guaranteed overpower for your damage, gives you your vulnerable damage to do your extra damage, and when you look above the target dummy, whenever you use anything that's not Bash, it gives this little circle here. What this circle is, that is your Pain Gorger's buff. All you have to do is hit any button, and then you're going to start bashing. So the rotation is 4, Bash, Steel Grasp. You wait 5 seconds, Hammer, Steel Grasp, and then you just continue to bash. That's really all of the rotation is. Now, you just need to make sure that you have this guaranteed overpower here. If you're doing a boss fight, so let's say you go to Lilith, or you're going to a tormented boss, these are 1, 2, 3 guaranteed overpowers for Hammer of the Ancients. Unfortunately, with Hammer of the Ancients, if you use it, it does not take the guaranteed bash here. It takes one of the other 2. When we use Hammer, it takes your Dominate one. That is kind of unfortunate because we want it to take this one and then we want the other ones to be used for bash, but that's okay. So this right here, it's going to be the last thing that you use. So if you run into these boss fights, and let's say you're running to Duriel, you kill the ads on the way, you get this up. On the way in, you're going to try and hammer twice to get rid of these buffs so that they'll come up as soon as Duriel spawns, and you've already used Hammer of the Ancients once. So you hit Hammer of the Ancients, and then you start attacking, pop all your buffs. So this is going to be your rotation as you go through. Bash 4 times, Hammer, Steel Grasp. If you get it out of order, it's okay. Just reset again the next 5 seconds. Other things to watch out for. Your Berserking buff. When you use Warcry, this purple buff here is going to be your Berserking. Now we're running Hectic Aspect here. If you can see our cooldowns, because of we're going to be running the Pain Gorger and we're going to be running the Harlequin's Crest with all of this cooldown reduction, our shouts are only 10 seconds long. So if we shout and then we start bashing, if you watch the cooldown on Warcry, it comes up right as Berserking falls off. So if we're bashing fast enough, we should always have Berserking up. We just keep that rolling. That's the build. Let me know what you guys think in the comments of it. If you like the build, if you want to change something, love to hear about it. I'm live on YouTube and Twitch pretty much every night. Stop by, Theorycraft with me. Let me know what you're doing with Bash. Catch you on the clip side.